Well, welcome everyone. I am Masha Belenky, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the 10th installment of the NCFS and Captivity book dialogue series, organized by Rachel Mesch, Susan McCready, and myself. Today we're discussing Patricia Tilburg's new book, Working Girls, Sex, Taste, and Reform in the Parisian Garment Trades. I am now going to introduce our participants today. Patricia Tilburg is the James B. Duke Professor of History and Gender and Sexuality Studies at Davidson College in North Carolina, where she teaches courses on gender, culture, and history in modern Europe, and especially modern France. She's the author of Colette's Republic, Work, Gender, and Popular Culture in France, 1870 to 1914, but that was published in 2009. And the subject of today's seminar, Working Girls, Sex, Taste, and Reform in the Parisian Garment Trades, 1880 to 1919, published in 2019 by Oxford University Press. She has served as secretary of the Western Society for French History and is currently co-president of the Society for French Historical Studies Conference in Charlotte in March 2022. If you would like to purchase this wonderful book, there is a discount code that Susan also put in the chat. Trish will be in dialogue with Susan Hiner. Susan is professor of French and Francophone studies on the Jean-Guy Vassar Chair of Modern Languages at Vassar College, where she teaches courses on 19th century French culture with a particular focus on women, literature, and fashion studies. She also teaches for Vassar's program in women's studies and will be directing the new multidisciplinary program, Global 19th Century Studies, beginning in the fall. Her first book, Accessories to Modernity, Fashion and the Feminine in 19th Century France, was published in 2010 by the University of Pennsylvania Press. And she's currently completing a new book entitled Behind the Seams, Women, Work, and Fashion in 19th Century France. And I'm going to turn it over to Trish. All right.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Masha, and thank you, Rachel and Susan, for creating this series this year. It's been really a year of a lot of Zooms for sure, but this has been a space that's been really welcoming and warm and stimulating. And I'm very grateful for all that you've done to create that. And I'm so grateful to Susan Hiner for being my interlocutor today to have this conversation. And thanks to all of you who are here for making the time when there's an embarrassment of riches in terms of things you could be attending, and we're all just completely out of energy if you're anything like me at this point. So I'm very, very grateful that you're all here. So I'm going to start by giving just a breezy overview of the book. So I'm going to begin with a quote from a 1908 study of working women's philanthropic groups in Paris. The Parisian working woman has had spun around her a kind of legend, charming and false like all legends. The working woman is the joy of Paris, one of its prettiest jewels, dressed up as she is with bits of nothing, and despite her simple clothing, always seductive with her light step, her amused little face, her lively gestures, her merry laugh. We also say that she is a little fairy who weaves marvels while being nourished only by fashion. The poets have celebrated her from time immemorial. The reality is less beautiful and should be better known, but lies are more pleasant than truth. So my book begins with this quotation because the book itself takes the mythos of the Parisian Midianite, the Parisian garment worker, as its primary field of investigation, to understand this part of the Parisian imaginary as a fantasy, but a fantasy with incredible political import. This narrative of Parisian working class femininity defined significant aspects of French popular culture, philanthropy, and labor reform, from the fin de siècle through the First World War and into the interwar. So from the 18th century, the Parisian garment worker held a singular place in French popular culture as a figure of passing romance for bourgeois men and a sign of France's supremacy in fashion and luxury craft. In the 1830s and 40s, these women became common cultural currency with the indelible grisette of romantic literature, notably, of course, Musset's Mimi Pinson. By 1900, the working Parisienne became a national icon and a fulcrum for concerns about women's work, reform, and national taste. Politicians, reformers, and culture makers deployed an insistently romantic vision of the Parisian fashion worker to manage anxieties about economic and social change. The grisette's granddaughter, the Midianite, loomed large in the social imagination of early 20th century France. Midianite is a term that originates in the 1880s. It's a term applied to women across the Parisian garment trades. We find it applied equally to workers in skilled haute couture, as well as more poorly paid piece workers, laundresses, errand girls, ready-to-wear workers. But also, Midianite had a different definition, or another definition at the turn of the century. If we look at the Trésor de la langue française, a Midianite was, quote, a young girl who was simple and frivolous and of naive sentimentality. So we start with these two definitions, a figure of labor, of work, and a figure of pleasure and feeling. Paris was also home to approximately 80,000 female garment workers at the turn of the century, living and working in largely pretty grim conditions, malnutrition and disease, dangerous, sometimes toxic working conditions, starvation wages, seasonal unemployment. As a result, women garment workers went on strike in Paris repeatedly from 1901 throughout World War I. 1901, 1908, 1910, they go on strike. 1911, they go on strike again. 1916, 1917, 1918, 1919. Again and again throughout these years, the Midianite are taking to the streets, making labor demands. But throughout these same years, Parisian Midianite are being imagined over and over again as naive and cheerful, laboring for the love of fashion. The attractive, young, single garment worker with a ready smile and inimitable Parisian taste, always with a randy flaneur nearby, is everywhere in turn of the century France, in French popular culture, in novels, in films, in songs, in plays, in social commentary, and even I found in reform campaigns. This working girl stood in for at once the superiority of French taste and craft and the political and sexual subordination of French women and labor. Nostalgia about a certain kind of France was written onto the bodies of working women across French popular culture and written onto the very geography of Paris with festivals, monuments, historic preservation, and guidebooks. The Midianite was also the very public face of tens of thousands of real working women whose demands for better labor conditions were modulated, distorted, and in some cases amplified by this type. So we're probably familiar with the notion of the tragic Victorian seamstress. This is a figure, the ill-fated unwed mother, the consumptive spinster in the garret, the soon-to-be prostitute. This is the image of the kind of cultural image of the Victorian seamstress. This tragic figure is also ubiquitous in French Romantic and social realist literature. The economic precarity and sexual availability of Paris's garment workers is being represented frequently as melodramatic danger. But the female garment worker, also distinct in many ways from what's happening in the English context, is seen as part and parcel of the aesthetic and spectacular pleasures of Paris, and crucial to French cultural patrimoine. The threat to these women was certainly thought to be a moral one, but their virtue elicited less anxiety than did concerns about threats to a French way of life, grounded in these workers' handicraft and innate fashionability. The benighted Victorian seamstress avoids the male gaze, is alone in her garret. The Parisian Midianite is herself an appealing urban spectacle, draws the male gaze, is a site of male pleasure and national pride. So here I am trying to move the working woman to the center of discussions of French modernity and look at the way that the Midianite inflected labor policy and reform efforts and even the daily lives of Paris's working women. To so insistently imagine Parisian workers as cheerful young fashion plates at a time which saw intense and unprecedented working class activism seems particularly revealing. The 19th century sees the discovery of the modern working woman as a social problem, as European states move from a pre-industrial economy in which female labor is a given to an industrial economy in which it is endlessly debated and surveyed. On the eve of World War I, French women's participation in paid labor was one of the highest in the world, between 35 and 40%. And the scrutiny of the wage-earning woman intensifies just as, and probably because, the skilled male artisan is finding his own economic and social status diminished with urbanization and industrialization. And as the homebound middle-class woman, the angel in the foyer at the hearth, becomes the ascendant feminine ideal. So women in the needle trades are on the front line of France's struggle with increasingly competitive international markets for luxury fashion goods. And yet it is only recently that scholars have really considered the midinette as a historical phenomenon in her own right. I propose the midinette as a fundamental type in the early 20th century French imagination. And I try to interrogate the work performed by this type. My research makes plain that French reformers, philanthropists, labor activists, feminists doggedly exposed the backbreaking conditions of the sweated garment trades, all the while eroticizing, romanticizing, and infantilizing the women they were committed to saving. Even as her body is imagined again and again as a consumable piece of the urban pleasure landscape, the midinette is also armed discursively with a nationally significant tastefulness. Historians have argued that the burden of safeguarding French national style rested squarely on the shoulders of the 19th century bourgeois woman. And this discourse around French taste largely excludes working class women. But was this the case for these women themselves and for others? My research suggests that by the early 20th century, the working class Parisienne had assumed a central symbolic role as a guardian of French taste. She was even presented at times by couture tradesmen, by government officials, as a possible antidote to the excesses of bourgeois feminine consumption. And what of garment workers themselves? Many understood that they were themselves key participants in the production of Parisian chic. And many of them lament the contrivance of the image of the midinette that they see all around them and try to foreground their own demands and experiences and push against dominant understandings of their labor, of their sexuality, of their political commitments. In some cases, garment workers even use the midinette image to their advantage as a means of accessing free classes, a justification for labor demands, as a defense of their craft, or even as a strike tactic. So I'm going to end just with a quick overview of the chapters. Chapter 1 offers a look at the grisette, the genealogy of the early 19th century grisette as a romantic literary type, who then becomes a figure of turn of the century nostalgia, a sign of romantic longing for a lost Paris by the turn of the century. At the same time, the grisette's granddaughter, the midinette, explodes into pop culture as a staple, inseparable from the erotic and entertainment landscapes of Paris in this period. Chapters 2, 3, and 4 explore the interactions between this ideal of the midinette, this romance and fantasy of the midinette, and efforts to regulate and reform garment work at the turn of the century. Very concerned state reformers and philanthropists build working women's lunchrooms, fight for better working conditions, all with the goal of protecting the Parisian working woman. But these initiatives depended on an understanding of couture workers born of bourgeois male fantasy and nostalgia for pre-industrial social and gender relations. So I look, for example, at a charitable organization set up named after Musset's Mimi Pinson, and look at the way that garment workers here get access to free performing arts classes, but also are defined by a particular vision of bourgeois desire throughout that initiative. Chapter 5 examines the wave of strikes in Parisian couture from 1901 through 1919, when thousands of garment workers take to the streets and win over time some substantial victories for French labor, even as the image of the midinette, with all her soothing eroticism and playfulness, intensifies rather than diminishes in the years of these strikes. And finally, chapter 6 examines the fate of the Midianite ideal in World War I, when the Midianite was embraced by the press and government agencies and trench soldiers themselves as a comforting and eroticized image of the home front. Some Midianite are able to push beyond the limits of this cultural role by initiating their own charitable campaign for soldiers, by taking advantage of a free nursing program to take positions in military hospitals around France. So the Belle Epoque Midianite marks an important evolution in the image of Parisian working women. The Parisian working woman is forever being drawn back in this period into the romantic frame of the 19th century grisette. And garment workers are used to render social change more palatable by reducing them often to objects of bourgeois delectation. But these women and their defenders sometimes were able to leverage this nostalgia into a modicum, at least, of cultural capital. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Susan, but I look forward to answering questions and hearing your comments.
Hi, thank you for that wonderful, wonderful taste of your book, which I have enjoyed immensely. I had the pleasure of reviewing it for 19th century French studies, and I think it's pretty obvious from my review that I really loved it. I also just want to take a second to thank Rachel and Masha and Susan for this incredible series. It's really, everyone has already said it, but I want to say it too. It's just been very meaningful for all of us to be able to be together and to have time to really, you know, pause over some of the things we've been working on and to celebrate those things. So we're here to celebrate this wonderful book. And so yeah, I'm going to start with some sort of general questions that might lead to some more particular questions in the Q&A from the people who are out there today. And then I also have some more specific questions if there's time. But really first, I think this is probably the question that everyone always wants to have the answer to, is the sort of origin story of your book. You worked on Colette before, also a great book. And I'm just wondering, what was the evolution? Why the Midianite? How did you get here? What drew you to the topic? Tell us about that.
So yeah, thank you for that. I think it's not a surprising tale. It was while working on my Colette book that I came across this topic and sort of had it in the back of my head as I was finishing that book. So in that book, I was interested in, part of the book deals with Colette's wild years as a mime in the Belle Epoque, because indeed there were surprisingly heated debates about pantomime in Belle Epoque Paris, and Colette was in the midst of it all. And in writing that chapter and working on her music hall career, there is one article that she writes in which she visits a working women's popular conservatory where her mime partner, George Vague, who's this very famous mime, because there was such a thing, many of those such things in Belle Epoque Paris. He was teaching a pantomime class to garment workers, essentially, to young working women. They didn't have to be young, but they're all talked about as young. He was teaching a mime class to them, and she goes in and sits in on it at the same time that Vague is giving her basically private mime lessons, and they're performing together all over France in these sometimes rather scandalous pantomime shows. So she goes to witness this class, and I was very interested in that book in Colette as a middle-class woman who is trying to move out of the norms of bourgeois femininity. She's constantly going back to languages of labor and work. And when she goes and observes actual working women, she always has some really interesting reactions. When she goes to this mime class, her reaction is that these are basically adorable little animals, right? Like little pets, are so cheerful, are so authentic. It would almost be a shame to teach them how to act, right, on some level, because they're so, I mean, it's very ethnographic, right, that she's sort of dropped into this working class world, and it's very paternalistic in a lot of ways. So I thought this was odd, just that there was a popular conservatory for workers to take free mime classes just seemed weird to me. And I always tell my students when they're looking for topics, look in the primary sources for the thing that seems odd to you, because that's probably a thread to pull on. So I found an archival collection at the Bibliothèque Historique de la Ville de Paris, in which the organizer of this conservatory was the composer Gustave Charpentier, who had come to fame and fortune through his opera Louise, which was about a Parisian dressmaker and her bourgeois lover. And I found this trove of documents. He seems to have kept absolutely everything related to this conservatory, this popular conservatory. It was open to all female Parisian workers, married or single. There were no age requirements. Classes were offered 2 hours every weekend from 8 to 10, on weeknights from 8 to 10, and on Sundays from 10 to noon. And they were held all over Paris, and you could go and take a free pantomime class from George Wag, for example. But their professors were drawn from the opera, from the opera comique, from the Conservatoire de Paris. These really prominent artistes and composers and performers were teaching these free classes to working women in the city. And he kept alongside all this stuff about the conservatory. In fact, it was a massive philanthropic initiative that also dealt with job placement, also had a kind of social function to some extent. Members, working class women that joined, sometimes went on tour with a performance that he did across France. Later in World War I, they're the ones that run this nursing initiative for working class women to get involved with the war effort. So it was really, there were just boxes and boxes and boxes, and that's just a dream, right? To find these.
Yes, absolutely. And to actually be able to get in there, which we can't do now. Yeah.
This is all very
Oh, it must have been just such a magical moment when you opened up the boxes and found this treasure trove. That's wonderful.
It was wonderful. And the strangeness just continued. Obviously, there were lots of aspects to it, but also he had kept his correspondence with a number of these working women that joined the initiative, this Conservatoire de Mimi Pinson, or the Oeuvre de Mimi Pinson, which was the larger philanthropic initiative that he ran. And they wrote to him a lot. And a lot of the correspondence was, thank you so much for doing this. It's great. It's great to be able to get out on the weekend and take a free piano class or whatever. But they also were very chummy with Charpentier in these letters and would ask him favors, would ask him to, get them a job at a certain place or that sort of thing. So it was really interesting to suddenly hear the voices of these women who, through Colette and others, I had always seen through a filter, right? That they were always being filtered through these bourgeois observers. And suddenly I'm hearing these women themselves. He kept their ID cards that they had to fill out. He had some of those when they became members. So it was really exciting. And it made me think about, as I dug into these documents, the competing visions between the organizers, mostly middle-class men that organized this initiative, and the working class women that joined the initiative and were members, and the conflict between their two visions. So the organizers imagined the women that they were helping as young, as cheerful, as loving their work, and taking these classes just to be able to go home and, sing a song for their father by the fireside. That was sort of the image that Charpentier had, that this would make the working class home more attractive and appealing. They did not want these women to become professional performers, and Charpentier is constantly having to defend against that when people say, you're just going to turn these women from honest lives as workers to become performers, and nobody wants that. He would say, oh God, no, of course not. Although he did keep a list of his former students that did become professionals that he was pretty proud of. So the organizers are often explicit about their goals here, but they're often explicit in ways that I found surprising at first and later realized was just the norm, very explicit about their own vision of young garment workers as sexually desirable, that they would drop comments about, when I was a boy, I had an affair with a garment worker, ha ha ha, I'm sure you're not like her, like lots of these sorts of things. And Charpentier himself, his long-term partner, was a garment worker. So that was on one side, the organizer's vision. And then on the other side, these women that I was hearing now and then through the letters to Charpentier, through letters to the Mimi Pinson magazine that the initiative put out, where they would write in with problems at their workshop or something like that. And these two visions collided at times, where the editors of the newspaper, for example, the magazine, would say, addressing members by their numbers in the letter to the editor section. Number 526, the question you asked is inappropriate. Please don't ask that again. Or member 327, please don't send us poetry. We just want to hear about your workday. These sort of trying to figure out like, this is what the initiative is for. Women are asking for something different. So anyway, that's where it began, sort of trying to move between the fantasy of Parisian working women on one hand and try, if I could, to excavate what that meant to working women in Paris at the same time.
Fantastic. Yeah, I love the story of the sort of evolution from the little episode in the Colette book. That makes a lot of sense, and the way that she was actually, participating in the perpetuation of the fantasy, really. Yeah. So, well, you sort of got into you're leading into my next question, which was going to be about the archive, actually. And it sounds like this Charpentier archive was really the mother lode for you. But I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about your experience with the archive, especially given that you're working with sources that haven't really been worked with. I mean, this is a different type of archive. You had a lot of sort of ephemeral material. And, I'm just interested to hear, and I'm sure our other participants here would be interested in hearing more about your experiences in the archive. And, I love the way you frame the way to explore as sort of pursuing it's like the sort of the catachresis in poetry. What's not working here? What's surprising? What's strange? What needs to be kind of more deeply explored or excavated, as you put it. So yeah, I'd like to hear more about your experiences in the archive, and just how can you elaborate on that for us?
So I went to a lot of different archives. Charpentier started me off, and I was really interested in that. But then it became clear to me as I moved outside of the Oeuvre de Mimi Pinson that this was not just some weird Charpentier fetish with garment workers, right? Or like he and Colette happened to share this idea of garment workers, but little by little, it began adding up, right? That this was in fact everywhere. And the ephemera that you refer to, I definitely looked at a lot of songbooks at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Louvois. There, it just, you barely could pick up a songbook that didn't have a cousette in it, or a couturier, right, a dressmaker, or a little modiste running around, or a copain. So that was really fun to just dive into. I'm trained as a cultural historian, and so that's where I want to be, right, is in Parisian Belle Epoque ephemera. At the same time, I went to the Archives Nationales and to the Prefect of Police to look at the government perspective on what was happening with working women. Perhaps expecting that there would be sort of, we've got the ephemera, and then we've got what was really happening, and strike reports and police spies telling us what was happening in those meetings, or government inquiries into the garment trade. And what was really astonishing and over time really frustrating to witness was the way that this gay image from the songs, from the plays, from the silent movies was throughout these labor commissions, these really dry documents where you're just flipping, months and months this labor commission is meeting, and you see nonetheless that this same image of the Midianite is being brought up often as a way of blocking reform. And that was really interesting to see. So I moved back and forth between those kind of archival worlds. I also spent some time in the Musée des Arts Décoratifs of Mode and Textile, where they have some of the archival materials related to some of the fashion houses themselves, in which you would see some designers like Madeleine Vionnet, who themselves had begun as working class women.
Yep.
That was really, really interesting as well, sort of moving in between spaces. I used the Gaumont Pathé online archive of films, which I recommend to anyone that is teaching undergraduates and you're looking for primary sources that people with not a lot of French or no French can look at, because they're able to just register basically for a free account. And I had a number of students this semester actually use the Gaumont Pathé. There's newsreels. I was able to find a newsreel of Charpentier himself surrounded by his Midianite, all laughing and kind of teasing him, which was and he gets his épée at the Sorbonne, and some of that was filmed, and so there's some of that. But it's a great teaching trove.
That's great. Great resource. Yeah, thanks for the tip. And it really sounds like you sort of ran the gamut of the types of archives you explored. Super interesting. So sort of related to that archival question, and it looks like we're getting some questions in the chat. So this will be my last question until we can cover some of the questions in the chat. Again, sort of a general question, and you did mention that you view yourself as a cultural historian. I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about how you view your approach in terms of what I think you termed in your book a new kind of labor history. I mean, I'm particularly interested in the way in which I feel like you explore how these women were actually leveraging their mythology in order to, make advances, maybe in baby steps, but they got there, I guess. Yeah, and so of course it's deeply connected to women's history and the sort of the obstacles presented to archival research when it comes to women, and in particular working class women. I don't know, that's sort of maybe an unclear question, but do you understand what I'm getting at?
Yeah, so I am a cultural historian and would not have been able to do this project without just the incredible work of generating labor historians.
Right.
The Midianite strikes and labor reform in the Parisian garment industries were important, but have mostly been somewhat side notes in larger labor actions for a number of reasons. The industry was seen as being particularly slow to action. Other industries, unions sort of looked down on the garment workers as being, again, sort of frivolous, not really understanding activism, but they were slow to unionize. And so they had been sidelined to some extent at the time in broader labor movements, but also somewhat side notes in the labor histories for good reason in some cases. But the Midianite, nonetheless, I found it sort of out of balance that it was being sidelined in these labor histories and yet was ubiquitous practically, right, in cultural approaches. She had this outsized presence, really, in culture of the time. So on one side, cultural historians are looking at the Parisian picturesque as this modernist invention framed by bourgeois anxieties about urbanism and industrialization, and here's the Midianite, she's everywhere, right? And then labor historians are producing these voluminous research on working class political movements and social reform and such, but here she's sort of a side note. So I wanted to bring those things together. So that labor commission that I mentioned, in 1901, there's this labor commission on night work in the garment trades in Paris. And the commission had 45 members, government inspectors and delegates, also a number of fashion couturiers. Gaston Worth was on the commission. And only 2 women on the commission were both garment workers, and they were delegates at the Bourse du Travail, the trade union exchange, Clémence Jusselin and Stéphanie Bouvard. And I found they were pretty much sidelined in the commission and people didn't listen to them very much. And I found it really interesting to see when they spoke, what they said, and what the responses were, particularly when they had back and forth with Worth himself as a couturier. And it felt like a really rich space to look at the way that every time they would bring up, but this is actually what we need. This is actually what working women are asking for. And Worth would say, yes, but the beauties of French taste, our French taste renown is the most important thing. We can't allow that, to go by the wayside at all. And you would see the commission sort of move on, right? As soon as Worth stood up, he would say, I know I shouldn't be speaking, but I have to, right? I have to say that French taste is the most important thing. And, Jusselin and Bouvard would sort of have to sit down and wait for their next.
Yeah, that's great. I'm going to move to some of the questions in the chat, which follow on some of what you've already been talking about, at least the ones that I'm seeing right now. And I'm going to do my best to get to as many as possible. The first question that I'm seeing is from Christine Tont, and she She says, I'm just going to quote, as highlighted in your presentation, it is only recently that scholars have really considered the Midianite as a historical phenomenon. Could you consider this phenomenon as an expression of a sort of social malaise?
Yes. Let me think about that though. Absolutely. What I think is interesting about the Midianite is she inherits everything that was associated with the grisette. And the grisette is herself already a figure of a kind of response to a new Paris, a new France, new working conditions, and already bears in her all of that sort of anxiety to some extent. And so I think that gets replicated and put onto the Midianite. I do think that when you see the overwhelming, just to have spent so many years with this image, I can't express how repetitive it was, right? Like, could not get away from the smile, from the smiling Midianite out for fun, with her well-turned boots, with her little skirt. With the image is just over and over again, and you really have to. She's hiding in plain sight, right? She's everywhere, and it was so repetitive that again and again, people talking about her little fairy fingers over and over again. The fairy fingers. If I saw one more person say, "Oh, but she has little fingers," I wanted to scream. Honestly, when you're thinking.
Meanwhile, when you think about what happens to your fingers when you're sewing and gluing, and
I mean,
of course,
it's
working class hands. Yeah,
in a kind of psychological sense that the sweated labor that is behind the image. The same thing happens with the lunch reform, that the image you cannot get away from. Culture stuff is that the Midianite doesn't eat, doesn't care about food because she loves fashion so much. She just eats a couple cherries at lunchtime. That's all she needs. And yet you see this coming through even in these sort of labor reform efforts. We're like, should we be concerned about the nutrition of the Midianite? And people are saying, oh no, they don't even like to eat. They just love fashion. Right? So to get back to Christine's question, I think that the insistence on their cheerfulness demonstrates underlying anxiety, right? Like the sort of the bourgeois man protests too much, right? They are so cheerful, that they're so ready for love, that they are so interested in fashion, that they don't need to eat, that they would work just for the fun of it. They don't even need to be paid. That to me does speak to deep social malaise around urbanization, housemanization, the new woman, right? It all comes together in Paris in this period.
Right. That's great. Thank you. That's an excellent response. We have another question from Ting Chang. She asks if you can comment on other historical instances of sexualizing, romanticizing, idealizing the female working class body, and what is distinctive about the Midianite. As you did your research, did you find resonances with what is happening in our times? And of course, she thanks you, as we all do, for your wonderful presentation.
So those are two really big ones. First, I don't think that it is. I don't think that the French garment worker is unique amongst global working women in her sexual vulnerability, in the sexual harassment and violence that is the sort of day-to-day. When I could find working class women's garment workers' memoirs from this period, it is sort of a red thread, right? Sexual harassment, sexual violence, the back-breaking labor, the finger-breaking labor. I don't think that they are distinct in that way. What is, I think, unusual in the French context is a constant association of that vulnerable, sexually available body with tastefulness and with national standing, right? That French national pride is wrapped up in the tastefulness and the sort of fashion love of these working women. And that particular chemistry, I think, is relatively unique to the French context. In thinking about resonances with our times, I mean, I end the book in my conclusion thinking about sort of global Me Too movements and thinking about the way that the garment trades in the era of fast fashion have been essentially spread out across the globe. And most of that labor is now being done not right across the street from the white bourgeois
Yeah.
journal in Paris, right? That where he can see this girl on the way to work every day, or this woman on the way to work every day, and fantasize about her. That now there has been this sort of moving of outsourcing of garment work to spaces that European, particularly fashion houses, don't want to kind of see, don't have to be faced with that labor. So I ended up feeling at the end of the book, maybe it wasn't half bad, right, to have this labor be so present to French journalists, to, right, the one thing about Paris, having all the government officials there, having all the kind of center of politics, center of culture, and that they were faced with a daily view of garment workers. They happened to turn it into this very spectacular, very romanticized image, but nonetheless, they had a visibility that I think garment workers do not have in many places.
Right. And but of course, as you're saying, that mythology in the 19th century or end of the 19th century functioned in a way to invisibilize and conceal the real conditions of the labor, not so much geographically, but sort of psychically or something. Yeah, another excellent question. Let's see, I'm going to move on to Matt Yost, who asks, it's, I think, maybe a follow-up to, I hope it doesn't sort of repeat. I'll read it. Let's see, wondering about any less exploitative representations of the Midianite you may have encountered, and namely, who might have been producing those representations. And I guess that kind of links up with something that I was wondering about too. When I think you referred to this in your presentation. I definitely remember it in your book, where you talk about how the sort of leveraging of the mythology to sort of make inroads. And yeah, I don't know if that's exactly what Matt is getting at, but.
Oh, I do. Yeah, this is something that was, I don't want to overstate that part of the, I see a thumbs up, good, that we're getting the question. I don't want to overstate.
Oh, good.
Overwhelming image that one finds in the primary material from this period is extremely romanticized, exploited, etc. But you do begin to see, particularly after these women have been striking for about a decade and we move into World War I, you begin to see in the labor documents, particularly working class women, garment workers, who are taking on the Midianite identity, not as something to be defended against, but we do find in some working class memoirs, for example, women who were seamstresses and become feminist organizers or something, who say that, I'm not like those Midianites, right? Not saying that image is not true, but saying it is true. They are frivolous, featherbrained, but I'm a different kind of woman, right? I'm a different kind of working woman. I'm moral, and I'm not silly, and I spend all my money on fashion. So you do find that, but you also begin to see, particularly as we move through the war years and years directly after the war, a language of Midianite activism that is very much sort of proud of that identity, who, speaking the language of the Midianite, speaking of and to Midianites. This is the part of the book where I dealt with Monette Thomas, who is a Midianite who becomes a labor organizer, particularly in the strikes of 1918 and 19. And she is talked about in the socialist press as sort of the voice of the Midianite in some way. And in her speeches, you can see that she is very sort of proudly using this esprit de Midianite. So that's one way in which we see representations that are somewhat different. But also, to your point, Susan, there are ways in which these women use the image to their advantage. First, I think that what I found again and again was garment workers were incredibly proud of their tastefulness and believed that they had extremely special skills, extremely special taste compared to garment workers in any other part of France. They're very proud of being in Paris. They're very proud of that work. So that part of the image meant something to them. And you see it coming through even in, government inquiries, that these women are talking about how tasteful they are and that they can do something special, that they can do something that other workers can't in terms of their perfection. And that was interesting to see.
Yeah, which they then display on their persons.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Yeah. Okay, let's see what else. We've got a number of questions. Marnie Kessler asks if you can say more about the visual representation of the Midianite. Do you find tensions, overlaps, similarities, and/or differences, etc., between her depiction in popular images and painting or high art?
It's really interesting. I would say that the ephemera, more
Mm.
pop culture stuff, the pop boiler novels, the cartoons, the postcards, lots and lots of postcards, tended to be more sexual, more body, right? I showed, the high art image is much more of sort of the smiling, pretty modiste on the boulevard, looking,
yeah.
but it's not necessarily lascivious. The sort of music hall world was met much more double entendres, a lot more eroticized, a lot more sexualized, and much more body. There was a song I remember from during the war in 1916 where it was written for a male music hall performer, and he sings if I were a Midianite, and imagines in the song that he's a Midianite and he's walking about and he's sort of like shaking his bottom and attracting soldiers, and then he ends up getting pregnant by a soldier in the song, having sex, getting pregnant, and then breastfeeding the soldier's baby. It's a really strange music hall song, right? I mean, the fantasy of the Parisian man that wants to, that what does it mean to be a Midianite? It means to go out and be impregnated by a soldier who's not going to marry you, and then you breastfeed. It's really interesting. So I would say
That's
that was
amazing.
the main difference I found between these worlds is that the more kind of pop boiler stuff is pretty body, and the maybe higher art is more aestheticized.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. More aestheticized, and maybe also you might, I mean, thinking just in terms of literature, you might get more of that sort of social consciousness kind of I don't know, representations in high art. I don't know.
Tragic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Let's see. Moving on to David Powell, who has a question about sort of archival stuff. He asks where you looked into literary representations of the Midianite. This is an entirely different avenue of study, but cultural historians, as you know, often use literature to bolster aspects of their studies. And he also suggests that maybe that's your next book project. I mean, I know that you did do some work with literary works as well in this book. Maybe you want to say a little bit more about that.
So I did some. The first chapter that deals with the grisette tries to step back from a number of these literary portrayals and talk about them. My interest was in figuring out what do they all have in common and what do they then bear? What is the inheritance then for the Midianite? The literature that I there were a number of novels that I used for the Midianite, not the grisette, but the later section, but they tend to be pop boilers. Right? They tend to be cheap, penny, garish, kind of colorful covers, and they tend to be Midianite who are mistaken for a duchess, right? There's always this sort of shifting of class, a very typical story, right? Or a bourgeois man that kind of marries the Midianite, but then or wants to marry the Midianite, but leaves her for the woman of his own class. These very melodramatic, but often pretty light material.
I just to interject there, because this is so interesting. Who are they for? I mean, who's reading them? I'm thinking of, I work in a slightly earlier period, and I have done quite a bit of research on modiste and vaudeville theater around modiste. And, one of the things that's so interesting about this is that the public is actually the working class too. So, yeah, or not entirely, but, it's a mixed public, but absolutely. I'm just wondering if that must also be the case for these sort of popular sources that you're thinking about.
Absolutely. And I didn't do a lot with reception of that material, but I think you're absolutely right that these are, there are working class audiences, and I think female garment worker audiences.
Right.
Material. I know that in the World War I chapter, there's a musical kind of ode to Mimi Pinson that they put on in the musical theater, in which she goes to war and falls in love with a soldier and it's all this stuff. And Charpentier's archives have all sorts of working women writing, please, can you get us tickets to that show? We really want to go see it. And we're going to bring our poilu, who's home on leave, we're going to bring him with us to the theater. And so there is definitely, to say that these images are kind of omnipresent and are being used in many ways to kind of block reform in these women's labor is not to say that these women didn't also enjoy this pop cultural image.
Yeah. Right. And David also had a sort of follow-up. He talks about the cover of the issue of La Parisienne you showed, I guess it must have been in your slideshow, with the woman's skirt pulled out in accordion fashion into what seems clearly to be a cocarde, suggests, sorry, my chat just moved. So suggests, I can't find it again. Oh, sociopolitical resonances. Yeah. Oh, that's a great point. Yeah, so in the cocarde, yeah, that's important. Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
That's from the war years. And the cocarde was an initiative that was started during the war. Charpentier, again, his garment workers, or not his, women that are members of his initiative come to him and say, these Red Cross middle class ladies are getting all the fun, basically, of helping the soldiers, not all the fun, I shouldn't be glib. They're able to serve the nation and serve the poilu, and we want to be able to do that as well. So the first thing that they do before they get to the nursing initiative is say, we are going to become pen pals. We're going to write postcards to the poilu and kind of lift their morale. And we're going to send them these tricolor cocardes as good luck charms, as amulets, sort of as protective charms, essentially. And as I investigated the cocarde initiative, the poilu, which we have some of those letters from the poilu back, many of them imagined this as a very sexual connection. And so that image from La Parisienne gets at that many of these garment workers saw it as like, we're just writing to the poilu to try to,
bolster morale.
And then they would get, Charpentier would get all these postcards back saying, like, can you give me her number? Like that sort of thing. Her address, I want to write to her directly. And the Charpentier would say, no, we're not doing that. That's not what this is about. And in fact, the one garment worker whose progeny I was able to find over a French genealogical site, there's a garment worker mentioned in the cocarde campaign who had a very unusual name that I could actually look up on a genealogical site, and found her granddaughter who's alive. And she sent me these letters that the poilu wrote to her grandmother when she was a young woman during the war, a teenager during the war, writing to these poilu, and she made them warm sweaters and would send them the sweaters. And the granddaughter, even now, all this time later, said, but my grandmother was not a Midianite.
Yes.
She just happened to be a seamstress who married a bourgeois painter and who sent these letters to poilu. But be careful, I don't think I can be helpful for your project because she was not a Midianite.
Oh, wow, that's fascinating. That's great. Well, I think we might be almost out of time, so I'm just going to end with something that that David sort of brought up earlier, and just because I'm interested too, just have you started thinking about what your next project is, and would you like to say anything about that? Or maybe you're still, like so many of us, trying to do right now, a little bit stymied. But yeah, just
pretty stymied at the moment. But I do, Monette Thomas, who I mentioned before, is this fascinating figure to me. I don't know if this is a project as much as it is a question that is on my mind, which is she sort of disappears after this spate of writing constantly in these labor newspapers and making speeches at the Bourse du Travail. And I sort of want to find out what happened to her. So that's really not a project. It really is just sort of, I've gotten to this place where I'm like, I want to just go on a sort of wild goose chase and figure out what happened to her, because I found her a really fascinating figure and unusual somewhat in that space. I'm also working on a piece that came out of the book, essentially, or I began working on, but never kind of fit in with the book, which has to do with conservation and fashion at the turn of the century, because there's a whole debate around the protection of exotic birds in France and England.
Yes, yes.
And France is the country that says, well, we can't really protect exotic birds because we need those feathers for our amazing taste.
It's our patrimoine. Yes.
And the British and Americans are like, no, we should definitely stop killing these birds. And I'm really fascinated by the French rhetorical movements around bird preservation, which I find really fascinating.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Especially when it comes to hats. So yeah, fascinating. I'm not really sure what happens now.
Well, thank you.
Oh, Masha. Okay, good. I was going to say I have more questions if we have more time, but I think we're done.
So I wanted to say thank you so much, both of you, for this amazing, fascinating discussion. The book, it just sounds absolutely fabulous. I can't wait to read it. But please join me again in thanking Patricia and Susan for this really fascinating and very informative conversation.